Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we are going to be reading true law enforcement horror stories. I hope you enjoy them. These stories are going to be from both perspectives, actually. Some of these stories will be from regular people being stopped or being harassed or being scared by sketchy cops. We will also be reading stories about cops themselves and the scary situations that they have been in. So, there's a little bit of both sides to this episode. I hope you enjoy the stories. So, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. Several years ago, I took a 911 call for a family reporting their teenage daughter was possessed. They claimed no possibility of drugs or a history of mental health issues, which I, of course, didn't believe for a second. Family members were holding her down, and I could hear two people screaming at each other in the background. I asked the caller to tell whoever was yelling at her to stop. The caller said, "It's her." I responded that I knew it was her, but whoever was yelling at her at the same time to stop. The caller said again, "It's her." Both voices. I kid you not, it was the creepiest thing I have ever heard. I've been doing this for 25 years and have heard many things. I know of man's inhumanity and the horrible things that people do to each other, but this was a different kind of evil. I was clearly hearing a young girl screaming at the same time an adult male was yelling back. I couldn't understand either language, but they were clearly two different voices. The family swore that both voices were coming from her at the same time. It made my skin crawl. The lieutenant listened to the tape later, and he looked at me and said, "Do you ever wonder?" Yes. Yes, I do. I've seen a lot of things in my career, things that would make a citizen doubt my sanity, from being dispatched to chase a UFO to responding to calls of ghosts. But the most unusual thing that happened to me was witnessed by several officers and a dispatcher. One evening, I had brought in a guy for a domestic violence, and as he was a bit rowdy, I was joined in booking by the sergeant and another patrolman. I'm in the process of booking Mr. Tough Guy when I glanced into cell number 1. There was a guy in there, short haircut, glasses, and a white t-shirt just staring at us. I ignored him because I didn't want him to start banging on the window demanding a phone call or something. So I finished the booking process and escort Mr. Tough Guy to his cell, walking past cell number 1. The guy in the cell just stood there, never saying a word or moving. We all then leave booking and go about our business. Sometime later, the sergeant asked me to check the paperwork for the prisoners to see if any were ready to transport to the county jail. I grab the paperwork and go into the booking to do a head count. Cell number 1 is empty. I panic and tell the sergeant, who also panics, and he and I begin to make phone calls to the detectives to see if they had moved the guy or had released him. They all say they didn't go into booking at all. I then check the computer and paperwork again, and the head count was accurate. So no one had been placed in cell number 1. We go to the dispatch office to check the surveillance video for booking. We rewind the footage to where I can be seen booking my prisoner. We fast forward to the point in the video where we all walk out. As soon as we walk past the door, the guy in number 1 blinks out of existence. We were all freaked out by the occurrence, believe you me. When we tried to transfer the video to a DVD and USB drive, the guy in the cell did not appear. We still hear and see stuff every now and then, and prisoners in the detox tank can be seen talking to someone in the direction of cell number 1, even though it appears empty. To this day, I'm wary of going into booking alone. This is back in the mid to late 1990s. I was riding patrol on the midnight shift when I received a burglar alarm to a closed business. From my experience, this means that someone just tried to, or successfully, burglarized one of the businesses on my beat. When I arrived at the business was a funeral home. Okay, no big deal, I'm telling myself. I park about 50 yards away, blacked out, looking for any movement in or out of the business. Nothing moving. I make an approach on foot, using my flashlight very, very little. Gotta try and keep the element of surprise. I approach the door, hoping that it would be locked. The door is unlocked, and I can hear the alarm going off. My backup arrives to help secure the perimeter. I call for the K-9 unit to respond. K-9 officer arrives and sees that it's a funeral home. He said he cannot deploy his dog because the dog won't discriminate against an alive or dead person and would attack. Oh crap. I've got to go in and check this funeral home, open every casket, check every gurney to make sure that no one is hiding in this funeral home. I had to do a gut check and remember why I signed up for this job. The words of one of my training officers echoing in my conscious. No one asked you to do this job. And his other famous saying, don't worry, son, police work isn't for everyone. Well, I wasn't going to let that SOB get the best of me. My partner and I carefully entered the building. My partner flatly refusing to open anything that could contain a dead person. I told him that I would do the checking and that he just needed to cover me. We start methodically checking the building, in the dark, room by room, casket by casket. I carefully lifted each lid and checked each coffin. Most were empty, but some were occupied. The ones that were occupied, I had to reach in and lightly touch the person to make sure that they were ice cold. If they weren't cold, they were the bad guy hiding in the coffin. That was a long night, a long time ago, but still, just as fresh like it happened yesterday. At the end of it all, there was no bad guy and no burglary. As a police officer, what is the scariest thing that a suspect has ever said to you? I'm not sure it was the scariest thing, but it gave me some reason to pause. As usual, I was working the street crimes and had finally arrested a target I had been after for a very long time. He was about 25 years old and was the admitted leader of a street gang named the Dark Side Posse. This is his story. The Dark Side Posse was the first street gang we experienced in our city. Sure, a few biker gangs had some ties to our city, but this was the new type of drug gang, which recruited kids and teens to do their dirty work. Similar gangs would some years later become affiliated with one of the national gangs like the Bloods or the Crips. However, at the time, they were the first and only gang and were just local. The leader was a fairly intelligent guy. He, in fact, had a full-ride scholarship to a university and a basketball scholarship. Unfortunately, he was already involved in the family business of dealing drugs. He was caught with dealer weight during a car stop and did a little jail time. That was the end of the scholarship and getting out of the neighborhood. At one point, I decided to talk to this posse leader. So I parked my car on his corner and just sat there, which was bad for business. He eventually came out and asked what I needed to leave the corner. Almost a bribe offer, but not quite. I told it I needed him to stop selling drugs on that corner and to take his business somewhere outside of my city. I told him that I knew that he was using kids to move his product, and just because he screwed up his own future, that didn't give him the right to mess up the futures of these kids. Boy, did that make him mad. He told me point blank that this was his corner, and he would sell drugs all he wanted, and I wasn't smart enough to catch him. He also made a veiled threat about making sure I was taking care of my own family, and how easy it would be for him to come visit my neighborhood. This is not what you want to hear from a drug dealer or a gang leader. I wondered how he made the correct assumption I had a family, and then I realized that I was wearing a wedding ring. I took the ring off that night and never put it back on. I vaguely explained/lied to my wife that it was an undercover thing. From that day, I made it my mission to catch this gang leader and user of children. I came up with a plan which would involve the transfer of a number of officers. The chief bought into my plan and set up round-the-clock walk patrols in just a 4-block area, making drug dealing in his immediate neighborhood impossible. Boy, was I popular with the officers who had to leave their air-conditioned cars and walk beats in the heat of summer, especially as they were not aware of the overall plan. Using a good, confidential informant, I got my target to move to a location which was good for audio and video surveillance. We actually recorded him completing drug transactions and taking money, then signaling to a child on a bicycle to deliver the drugs. I took my evidence to a grand jury and got a multi-count sealed indictment against him for leading a drug distribution network and employing juveniles in the distribution of drugs. Bail was set at a staggering $1 million cash. This was unheard of in this area in the 1990s. I wanted his arrest to have maximum impact on the neighborhood, so I had the state police teams unit execute both a search warrant on his house and make the arrest. About a dozen highly trained troopers in special raid gear crashed the house with machine guns, and he was in custody in less than a minute. This team was awesome to watch in action. Once the house was secure, I went back into the kitchen, which is where my dealer was seated, with his hands cuffed behind his back. I said to him, "This is a multi-count, sealed indictment and warrant for your arrest. Your bail is $1 million cash." I looked at him and he was shaking. His eyes were wide, trying to make sense of what was happening to him. Gone was the cocky thug who thought that he could intimidate me. All that was left was a criminal who looked scared to death. He stayed in the kitchen for about 15 minutes, but no other words were spoken between us. He just kept quietly shaking and looking down at the ground. We finally got the word to take him outside, and I realized the reason for the delay. As we exited the front door, cameras were snapping from the press, and we were on the front cover of several newspapers. I think they waited for the press to arrive and did what is now called a perp walk. He went away to prison. Unfortunately, others took over his drug trade, but the dark side posse collapsed without a leader. About 7 years later, I was at the scene of a disturbance outside a social club with a bad reputation. I'm standing on the front steps as people are filing out. A rather large, well-muscled man stops at the door and says, "Remember me?" I looked at him for a minute and said, "Yep," and called him by name. He said he just got out and was going straight. I didn't believe him, but it seemed things between us were now okay. I would read later that he got mixed up in some kind of organized crime hit and may or may not have been in either witness protection or prison. I don't ever expect to see him again, and that's a good thing. So this was back right after 9/11 happened. I'm a female, and I was 24 years old, and I was driving my way back across the country to get to my son, who was with my ex. I had been out of state taking care of a sick family member. It was in the middle of the night in New Mexico, and I saw police lights behind me. I was exhausted and annoyed because I hadn't been speeding or anything. There were not really any other cars on the road at the time, and I was close to the exit for the hotel that I had planned to stop at for the night. I pulled over, and the cop came over to the driver's side window, which in itself was weird, because usually they come up to the passenger window on busy roads, and this was a highway. So I give him all my stuff, and he just stared at me for the longest time. He walked to his car and then returned almost immediately. He told me to step outside the car. Okay, I was worried at this point, because I had gotten tickets before, but being asked to step outside the car was not the norm. I did as he said, and he asked if I had been drinking. I said I hadn't, and then I asked why he pulled me over. He said I was driving erratically, which was not true. He then asked me if I was a terrorist, which was absurd. I was a young American white woman just driving, so there was really no reason for this question. It's weird, and I was a veteran with an ID as well. He gave me a walk-the-line drunk driving test, which I passed, and then said that he needed to search my car to see if I had drugs. I thought about this for a minute because I knew my rights and all, but it was so late and I was just so tired. I just didn't want to deal with all of the BS of refusing, so I gave him the okay because I knew I didn't have anything in my car. So when he got to my truck, he opened up a small suitcase I had that was my dancer stuff. He asked about it and I told him that I was a stripper. This really set him off and he started screaming at me about being a trash person. This made me angry, and I started looking around at my situation. I was alone for the most part with this weird guy. and every once in a while a car would pass by, but for the most part the roads were empty. It was the middle of the night, and I didn't have anything on myself to protect myself, and he obviously had a gun. He told me that I needed to walk back into the tree line that was next to the road. I stared at him and said no. I demanded that he call for backup and for other officers to come. He was thrown off by this. I said I wanted a female officer, and I would no longer comply with anything he said, and then I started trying to wave down cars when they passed by. He told me to calm down, wrote me out a speeding ticket, and let me go. I never paid the ticket and never heard a word about it. This was 20 years ago. At the time, I was really shaken, and I just forgot about it. But looking back, I don't think that he was a real cop. So this happened earlier in this year. For a little background, I'm a 30-year-old male, married, 29 at the time, with a young daughter. I live in a rural Northern California town, pretty much right in the epicenter of the gold rush, and I don't know if it's all the ways the land was taken or the ways people killed for wealth back then, but it's always seemed to have a higher share of strange recluses and sovereign citizen types. That being said, this is not a haunting story or strange people of the woods, but it was by far the most frightening encounter I've experienced as a father. Some time ago, I ended up with an extra day off, and my wife and I decided to go for a drive and check out a semi-local gun show. From time to time, I'll get tables at them and have friends who do them regularly, so we went to visit as I'm always looking for obscure parts and pieces of old military weapons, and had some family that lived in the area of this show as well. We had a hell of a winter last year, so unsurprisingly it was a cold, gloomy day. We drove about an hour and knew the promoters, so walked right in. As I was passing tables in search of the right stuff, I was carrying my daughter with me. She was very small and ridiculously cute, so everyone wanted to look and ask about her, which is normal from what I'm observed from parents. At times, you even draw a small crowd, usually of sweet little old ladies, and some grandpa types. As a side point, I had one really grumpy lady tell me that she was way too young. I looked at her confused and said she's like 3 months old, she'll never remember. Back on topic. There was one man who seemed a bit more excited than most men his age, but he said that he had worked as an EMT and in a NICU for years, so it seemed reasonable that he was happy to see healthy babies. As the afternoon went on, he passed me a few more times, moving against the crowd. That was the first sign, and commented on how beautiful she was. As babies often do at that age, my wife soon needed to breastfeed our daughter. She went out to the car and had blinders in the back seat so she could have privacy and keep the baby from distractions. I turned on the heater, locked the doors, and went back in to help a buddy sell during a busier point. About 10 to 15 minutes later, my phone starts ringing with my frantic wife on the other end. About 3 minutes before, I had noticed that law enforcement had gotten up and walked outside of the show. It took a minute to calm her down, but apparently the guy had followed us outside and been watching closely. My wife got the sudden feeling that makes your hair stand up whilst feeding in the car. That was when she saw a shadow standing outside her door, blocking it from opening, holding a small metal tube, a mag light. At that same moment, a sheriff pulled up who had also seen us go to the car. The officer asked what was going on, and the man tried to say that he was talking to my wife, who rolled down the window slightly and said she was not and didn't want to either. The officer asked him his name, and then when the officer turned around to run the name, he tried to scurry away. The name was fake, hence why the other officers got up. Detained, he gave his real name, and within 1 minute of calling it in, the man was turned around and arrested. Turned out he had felony warrants for kidnappings. The man was waiting for the nearby cars to leave. He was about to try and take my wife and infant daughter. Had that cop not been right there, who knows how it might have unfolded. Luckily, there was a cop when we needed one. This is a story my friend told me that happened to her older sister. She goes to a large private religious university in Utah. She was staying in an apartment not too far from campus with 3 other girls. The semester had just started, and 2 of the 3 girls were asleep. My friend's sister was on her phone sitting in the living room when she heard what sounded like footsteps outside the window behind her. She listened closely and dismissed it as a stray cat or dog. Soon after, she heard a thud against the dining room wall coming from the outside and heard what sounded like muffled whispering. My friend's sister is an excellent marksman, so she decided to scare whoever was outside by opening the blinds, turning on the lights, and grabbing the shotgun she kept on the mantle and pointing it at the window while screaming for the other girls to wake up. She saw a short man wearing all black and a ski mask running away. The cops came shortly after and she filed a report. Fast forward to a few weeks later, my friend's sister keeps seeing a small white truck with tinted black windows following her. She dismisses it as her imagination, but it freaks her out a little bit. One weekend, her roommates have gone out of town, so it's just her by herself. Right as she's trying to fall asleep, she hears a pounding at her door. She bolts to the door and looks through the peephole to see a cop standing there. "Who are you?" she asks. "I'm a cop," says the guy. "Open up, it's the law," he yells menacingly. My friend is starting to call BS, but she's scared of disobeying him if he actually is a cop. "Why are you here so late?" she asks. "Remember a few weeks ago when that guy tried to break into your house? I have an update on him." My friend is freaking out now, because why would a cop come try to talk to her about a case so late and by himself? He wasn't even the officer who helped her fill out the report. "Show me your badge," she demanded. He pulled it out and shoved it into the peephole, and my friend sighed a breath of relief. Right as she was unlocking the door, she glanced down at his legs and noticed this cop had very elevated platform boots, a machete on his utility belt, and the name on his uniform didn't match the name on his badge. "You're not an effing cop," she yelled at him. The fake cop screamed and started slamming on the door saying, "I'm an officer of the law and you will obey me. Open up, police." She called 911 and held her weight behind the front door, clutching her shotgun until the cops arrived. The guy was long gone by then, but he left behind his cap, which was a prop from a party store. The day after this, my friend broke her lease, moved to a new city in Utah, transferred schools, and bought a Doberman to keep her company. They never caught the guy, so hopefully he never does this to another girl again. My cousin had moved into a house in St. Kilda with her fiancé, and not long after began receiving strange letters in their mailbox every day. The letters made no sense and seemed to be very religious and were quite amusing. They began collecting these letters and sticking them to their fridge and having a little giggle with their friends over coffee while reading what they thought were the ramblings of some strange religious group. After a few weeks, my cousin and her fiancé became friends with their neighbors and invited them over for dinner. While sitting in the kitchen, their neighbor noticed the letters and exclaimed, "You get them too?" My cousin's fiancé Scott laughed and asked if hers said the same thing, but his laughter was cut short as he noticed a very worried look on her face. He asked what was wrong, to which she replied, "You haven't worked it out yet?" She then proceeded to tell my cousin and her fiancé to take the first letter of every word and put them together. They got the letters and proceeded to do so, finding a shocking, hidden message in each detailing the writer, still in a crazed fashion, stabbing, assaulting, and killing someone. Their neighbor explained that it was from an ex-policeman who was corrupt and now mentally unstable, who sent letters out to the houses of the people that he was involved with, lived, or used to live. Although these people, police and criminals alike, had long since moved, he continued to send letters to the same address. As the weeks went on, my cousin continued to receive these letters with increasing frequency. No longer was it a letter a day. They found a new letter every time they left the house. It wouldn't matter how long they would go out for, whether it be an hour or 5 minutes. When they returned home, there would be a new letter. This started to trouble my cousin, as she now knew that this man was watching their house all the time. Another frightening thing my cousin would later find out from her neighbor is that the person sending the letters soon began to address these twisted letters to the new occupants. One of her neighbors moved from her house as she began receiving letters with her name now appearing, instead of the old owners. My cousin and her fiancé eventually moved, and were not harmed by the sender of the letters. I answered a welfare check call one night late, between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m., on an elderly woman who lived next door to the caller and had not been seen for some time. This night, we were having a bad thunderstorm without the rain. I get to the complainant's house to speak to her first, wondering why she called at this time. She tells me the lady next door is in her 90s, lives alone, and she has not seen her in weeks. She explained that she has called, went over, and knocked on her door, but the lady will not answer. I start thinking she's probably deceased, and has been for some time. The car has a 3-inch layer of dust on it. The mail is piling up and no lights are on. First, I walked to the side door and knocked on the door with my flashlight, knocking loud enough that an elderly person with some hearing should hear it. After a few minutes of no response, I turned around and walked to the backyard looking at the windows and find everything okay. The complainant is with me and is saying that she doesn't know any of the relatives of the lady. I'm sure by now that she is probably deceased. I walk to the front of the house and notice that her blinds are up on the front windows, and I can see a glow from inside. I'm, however, not tall enough to look into the windows, which are probably 7 feet off the ground. The complainant runs next door and grabs a bucket for me to stand on. I get on the bucket and bingo, I can see the living room. The glow was from the TV, which was on a blue screen, and is bright enough that I didn't need my flashlight to see in. I looked first at the floor to make sure that she had not fallen there. Couch, recliner, everything was empty. The telephone home base was blinking red with the missed calls and voicemails. From the living room was a hallway that was dark and I couldn't see down. Using my flashlight, I could only see an open door down the hall. Still no signs of life. I turned around and told the complainant that everything looked okay and nothing was disturbed. I turned back around and an elderly woman is looking back at me with her face right up next to the glass. I couldn't breathe. It felt as if I had been hit in the chest by a bat. I fell backward and off of the bucket. I hit the ground hard and the complainant rushed to me. I pushed her off as she was trying to help me up, and I ran back up on the bucket. My heart was pounding, but I had to see. Instinct had my hand on my gun. The other was up to the window. I looked back inside and saw a frail elderly woman standing in the hallway, wearing a long nightgown with her back to me. She turned her head to the side and looked at me out of the corner of her eye and slowly walked out of view and down the dark hallway. That really unnerved me. I got down and looked at the complainant, who was standing there with a puzzled look on her face. All I could say was I saw her. By now the wind had picked up and it began to rain. I began to walk back to my car by the road and I turned back to the complainant and said, "Don't come back here." I got into the car and drove to the police department. I never found out about the lady who lived there. The complainant didn't call back, and the house now has different tenants inside. Some things are better left alone. Who is the scariest person you ever encountered as a police officer? The one that stands out to me is a 911 call where, on a cold winter night, when you could never wear enough clothes to stay warm, the apartment resident has an argument with a man who said he was going to return with a gun and shoot him. The apartment was a couple of blocks away. We were at the police station and my partner was on the toilet with the runs. He had smoked a cigar earlier and swallowed a bit too much tobacco juice. Life in patrol, where there is always a side story. I was very impatient and rushed him off the pot. I was thinking if we didn't hurry, it wouldn't end well for the victim. When we arrived, another 2-man police car arrived. We all walked into the apartment building, pistols in hand. I was point. 3 cops very close behind me. Lighting was dim. Long, narrow hallway leading to the apartment. We quietly walked to the apartment door, not hearing any telltale sounds. The door was ajar. It opens inward. I stood on the hinge side, back away from the opening, out of what we call the funnel of death. All 3 cops right behind me, so close that we're all touching, our guns still in hand and ready for whatever fate brings us. This kind of thing is so frequent that our pulse is barely elevated. It's a way of life for us. I hear music, not unusually loud. Lights are off. It's dark in there, but it's 2 a.m., so that's expected. With my free left hand, I push on the door. It barely moves. The carpet is rubbing on the bottom of the door, giving it a bunch of resistance. We don't announce our presence, although we should have, thinking it doesn't hurt to look first before entering, then evaluate, because we still have the advantage. No one knows that we're there. So I lean in, center my left hand on the door, push it open, and it's not easy. Gun-handed extended, and leading the way as the door comes fully open. My body is now fully in the funnel of death, my eyes straining to see into the dim-lit room. 3 cops still right behind me. What comes into focus next is a man seated against the back living room wall, shotgun low and pointed at my belly maybe 30 feet away. All my mind is saying is, it's gonna hurt, back out of the kill zone. But I can't. The word gun won't pass my lips fast enough. I never hear those words as audio exclusion has taken over, which I had learned is a natural response in extreme situations. I'm trying to step back and push the officers back, but my partner is all over me, and the other cops were all over him. Of course, it's probably only a split second, but it seemed like a lifetime. As the cops behind me give way, and I back up out of the kill zone, I see the gun fall to the floor, and the man simultaneously drops to the floor and prones out. He yells something, but I'm condition red, so I don't comprehend anything. To this day, I don't know why he didn't shoot, but from his point of view, as the door slowly, freakily opened, all he saw first was my 9. He would have likely skated on any charges. As the door swung fully open, he then saw a uniformed cop with the business end pointed at him. He was thinking it was the game over for him. As my partner gathered info for the report, I walked outside into the freezing weather, which now felt like a warm summer night. Additional cops were arriving. One, a close friend of Richard Washington, walked up to me and asked how the call was progressing, and to his surprise, I grabbed him in a bear hug and held him like a lover. I told him it was good to see him, that I just had a close call. The next day, a news reporter wanted to have an interview, which had been cleared by an admin. All I remember saying was that when I woke up the next morning and looked out to my backyard preparing to come to work, the trees and grass looked so much greener and prettier. It was so good to be alive and healthy. While working narcotics, one of my partners reported a fight. I ran around the back of a building. As I came around the corner, I came face to face with an 18-year-old kneeling with a gun to the head of a guy on the ground. It took less than a second to see number 2 and number 3 doing the very same thing. I never saw number 4. Oh, and it was 3 a.m. and dark. My gun was out and aimed at number 1 in the half step it took to come to a stop. I yelled, "Police, drop the weapon." As the word weapon came out of my mouth, my finger was on the trigger. Just as I started to squeeze, number 1 did the smartest thing of his life. He, while holding what turned out to be a Ruger Redhawks, with both hands, pushed it away from him, landing 2 feet away from him but closer to me. In the millisecond it took for the gun to hit the ground, I saw motion at number 3, raised up and saw a mirror image of a man raising up his weapon, pointed at me. I fired twice. I heard 2 shots returned. I was later told it was the echo of my shots, and if it was said by anyone else but my partner, I would still believe the other guy shot as well. The guy turned and ran away between the buildings, as well as the other 3. I still thought there were only 3 at this point. I was 27. I thought my career was over, as I just shot at a guy and missed with an apartment building behind him. We chased at least 2 of them over the hill from West 25th towards Major Hooples, just to give you some idea of where it was and who I worked for. I grabbed the Ruger as we chased the former owner of it over the hill into the brush, By the time the bosses got there, we had one in custody, and I was asked about the description of the one that I shot at. I gave my description to several bosses who obviously did not believe a word I had said. 6 to 6'2", slim black male wearing a tracksuit, the old polyester style, zipper jacket with some word in white letters on the back. Oh, what color? Petty blue. Our bosses and their bosses walked off a bit and would spend the next 3 minutes shaking their heads and looking back at me. Why 3 minutes? Because that's how long it took a responding zone car coming from the west towards Lutheran to go speeding by a guy, limping fast, headed west away from our location. They stopped, hooked him up, and brought him to the scene. Guess what he was wearing? His limping? It was the cause of the 2 shots in his left leg right into the car keys in his pocket, which they had to dig out along with my 2 rounds. My shots were low, but they were less than 1.5 inches apart at over 75 feet away, under stress with a gun pointed back at me, in low light. So, F that guy. This one time, I went out on the call of a suspicious person at a house near where I was at. When I get there, the guy tells me that someone knocked on his door, and when he went to see who it was, there was a woman standing in his driveway with some sort of child-sized doll with horns, and it looked like it was all bloody and cut up. So, he asked the woman, who was looking away from him, what she wanted. She turned around and told him, "It needs food," then started screaming at the top of her lungs and ran at him. So, like a normal human being, he slammed the door shut in her face and called the cops. I get there, and there are well-defined claw marks on his door. There's also a good bit of blood, I suppose from her fingers. So I call it out and start the search on foot. I also had 2 or 3 units driving around the area to see if they can't find this chick. So I'm about a block away, and we get another call that the woman is back at the guy's house, but in the backyard. So I run about a block back to the guy's house and bust into his backyard. The lights are out, so I have my flashlight on and I'm looking around. I see the chick huddled in the corner next to an evil-looking doll thing, and I ask her if she's okay. She doesn't say anything. About this time, one of my mobile units comes back to the house and parked his unit where the headlights were shining on her, so we could see how scary this chick looked. She had long black hair. Her clothes were rags. She had no shoes. Clearly homeless, and she kept whispering things to the doll. So my buddy and I approached and tried talking to her, and she just kept whispering to the doll. We couldn't understand what the hell she was saying, so we decided to drag her out of there. The second we put hands on this chick, she went berserk, punching, kicking, slapping, all kinds of stuff. So we're fighting with her, trying to get her on the ground, and she's not going down. This chick was strong as hell. Well, in the fight, she somehow got away from us and was sitting in a crouched position with her head tilted to the side and making the creepiest growl/snarling sound that I've ever heard. Then she screams at the top of her lungs and charged at us. So my buddy straight jabbed her in the face and knocked her clean out. We cuffed her and hauled her off to the hospital, where she tested positive for PCP and various opiates. She was charged with battery of a peace officer, resisting arrest, and trespassing. Later, she was institutionalized for some sort of mental disorder. Not quite sure what it was. My department didn't have anything more to do with her after her booking into the jail. My old roommate's dad was a former naval officer and then FBI agent. 20 years in the Navy and 12 to 15 years or so in the FBI. One of his strangest stories was from his FBI days. I'll paraphrase it below. A kidnapping case. This girl disappeared from her grandparents' RV sometime between like 5 p.m. and midnight. They were up front. Next thing they know, she's gone. She was supposed to be sleeping in the back. One stop at a rest stop. Then they were in stop-and-go traffic, so they figured that she must have popped out the door at some point. This is near the California-Nevada border, so we meet them, talk to them. This is within about a day or so, and the girl's still missing. No sign of her. She was only 15. Local police department theory is that she ran off because she's 15 and wants to get away from her lame grandparents for the summer. But there's a busted window, glass inside the vehicle, so we're treating it like a possible kidnapped person. After a few hours, there's a couple different theories on the case. One is that she ran off, another that she got snatched. Nobody's seen the girl in almost 2 days now, and disappearing in the desert for a young girl is tough. Next thing you know, we get a phone call. Naked girl lost and confused, picked up by some trucker on a 2-lane road out there called Nipton. Runs into I-15 between Barstow and Vegas somewhere, right near the border. Matches our description. Me and 3 other guys head out there to meet with the sheriff who's got her. Turns out she's our girl. She's fine. No R word, no bruises, no exposure, nothing. Completely healthy, completely fine. Even clean like she took a shower. Won't tell us a dang thing. Doesn't remember anything. According to her, 1 minute she's in the RV. The next, she's naked walking down the side of the road in 100-degree heat. We talked to her for 2 hours while her grandparents headed out to pick her up. We had our social services lady talk to her. Nothing. I've seen people hiding things. She wasn't hiding anything. She honestly didn't remember. It was the weirdest thing. Anyway, girl was found. She was fine. So we turned it back over to our local PD to figure out what happened and determine if charges were pressed and all. I kept in touch with a guy I knew there because I was curious and we were in a fantasy football league. A few months later, he tells me the parents sent the girl to a therapist to look for repressed memories to make sure that she wasn't R-worded or anything. Therapist said that she seems fine, but honestly has no recollection of her time at all and doesn't think that there's any point to delving much further since she has no symptoms and is largely more confused by the reaction than the event. So to this day, we've got a busted RV window with glass on the inside, likely from a moving RV on a jam-packed freeway, likely in broad or lightly fading sunlight, with 0 witnesses. A 15-year-old girl gets out or is taken out, and is taken somewhere safe nearby for almost 2 days, and then is stripped naked without being touched sexually, cleaned up and deposited on the side of a separate road a few miles away. She didn't have a drug in her system that we could detect. She remembers nothing at all. Nobody knows what happened to her clothes or anything. Been almost 20 years since this happened, and I can't figure out what the hell went on with this girl. Still bugs me at night that I have no way to explain it, aside from she lied the whole time. But I know liars, and I'd bet money that she wasn't lying at all. I arrived to work at 6 a.m. I finished work at 10 p.m. the previous night and ended up running into an assault on an old man on the way home. My commute was about an hour, so instead of getting home at 11 p.m., I get home at around 11:45 p.m. I have a quick bite with my wife and get to bed around midnight to 12:30, up at 4:15 and back into work. At about 6:15, I'm on station duties, and a man comes in and says that he thinks his wife is missing. He's very sketchy on details, and I'm just having to drag information out of him. Essentially, they had a fight. She stormed out and didn't come home that night. I check her in the system, and she's a respondent for a couple of DV orders. I dig a little deeper, and I discovered that they're actually against her son rather than her husband. I'm very, very tired and a little bit cranky. I look at the bare information I have and send the chap home to wait for his wife. I check the hospitals, our own system to make sure that she hasn't been arrested, and local fire and ambulance services. Nothing. I circulate her details to all units in the city and record the incident. I've done enough to cover my butt, and technically there isn't actually anything else for me to do for a while. I go and get a cup of coffee, and all I want to do is go to sleep, but something didn't set right with me. I was suspicious of her husband. He seemed like he was hiding something. I went down to my skipper and asked him if I could go to the house and have a look around and maybe talk to the husband again. The skipper isn't delighted about it because it means he'll have to cover the desk while we're short-staffed, but he agrees like a trooper and off I jolly well trot. I arrive at the house and talk to the husband again and ask him if I can have a look around. There might be something that might shed some light on where she might have gone. I have a scout around the house and find several containers of pills with weird names. A quick Google later, and I discover that this woman appears to be on a cocktail of antidepressants, mood stabilizers, and some other stuff. Oh, and I found an insulin kit. I ask her husband about these, and he mentions that his wife has had some emotional problems, but that he didn't think it was relevant. I sit him down and put it to him that there's a lot of medication here, and does his wife have more than one insulin kit? He goes pale at that point. She'd left all her medication at home. I ask him where she keeps her purse, and we end up checking her bedside locker. Her purse is missing, but I snag a framed picture for future reference. I have no idea what this woman looks like, and I ask her husband if I can search the room. He's beginning to break down at this point, and tells me that I can do whatever I please, and storms off down to the living room. I'm feeling distinctly queasy at this point, to say nothing of a banging headache from sleep deprivation. I don't find any suspicious holes in the wardrobe, where she might have taken clothes, any secret stashes of cash or drugs. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I searched the bed. I turned over his pillow and there's a note under it, and it's a self-unaliving note, explaining in no uncertain terms that the missing person is intending to end her life, and that she can't go on, and that she's sorry for being a burden. I radio the station and update them. I then have to walk down to the living room and tell this woman's husband that he had been sleeping on her self-unaliving note overnight and never noticed. That was probably one of the hardest things I've ever been called upon to do, bar dealing with dead children. I found her eventually, though it took another 8 hours. We pinged her phone to a nearby town, but that just gave us a general locality. I put the town to her husband, but he said that she didn't have any friends or family there. After 15 minutes later, he calls me back and tells me that they've spent a weekend there shortly after they got married. I call the hotel they stayed in on that occasion, but they've no one by that name. I went down in person and showed them the picture, and the lady at the desk told me that a guest answering that description had just left off for a walk on the pier. I went out to the pier and found her, and we had a bit of a chat. Nothing dramatic. She told me I looked awful, and I said that I was just very tired. I asked her to give life a chance for a few more days, that her husband loved her, and that she wasn't a burden. She agreed and we brought her home. A couple of days later, she came to the station with a box of chocolates and a card that read, "Thank you for not letting me unalive myself." When I realized how close I had been to just letting the matter rest because I had ticked all the boxes on the list, I went to the toilet at the back of the station and threw up for what felt like an hour. She sends me the same card every Christmas. I've been a cop for a while now, and this is one of the calls that still haunts me. I get a call for a domestic assault that had just occurred, and I learn that the victim is at the neighbor's house. I get there and find the female victim's throat had been cut from ear to ear. The neighbor is holding a towel up to her slit throat, and the victim is struggling to breathe. The paramedics are on their way, and I take over holding the towel for the neighbor. I'm trying to apply enough pressure to reduce the bleeding, but not so much pressure that I'm strangling her. It was a delicate balance. Quick law lesson. You know that there are laws against hearsay, right? Basically, I can't testify in court about the events that someone else told me about that I didn't witness personally. The person who witnessed it would have to testify to it. One of the exceptions is what's known as the dying declaration. If someone is on their deathbed and believes that they are about to die, their statements are exempt from the hearsay rules. I have some serious doubts that this woman is going to live. I want to ask her who slit her throat. In order for it to qualify as a dying declaration, I need to be able to testify that she believed she was about to die. So I asked her 2 questions. The first was, "Who cut your throat?" Which she answered. The second was, "Do you realize that you may be about to die?" Which she answered yes. Our eyes were locked and I still remember the emptiness. Within a few minutes, the medics showed up, and my partner and I went next door to look for the suspect. The door was ajar, and we could hear a baby screaming upstairs. We went in with guns drawn, and the metallic smell of blood was overpowering. We made our way upstairs, past smeared bloody handprints on the walls, and found the child upstairs. He was unharmed, and the suspect was long gone. Thanks to the excellent performance of the medical staff, the victim survived. I met with her a couple of weeks later, and I was very apprehensive to speak with her again. I had basically looked at her and told her that she was going to die. When she opened the door, I could tell that she didn't recognize me. She had very little memory of what happened after she was assaulted. I told her who I was and she hugged me, crying, and she thanked me for saving her life. The suspect ended up pleading guilty, so I never had to testify as to what I had told the victim that night, and it still haunts me to this day. The scariest call that I've ever had was a medical call involving a 3-year-old girl. The first department I worked for required all officers to be first responder certified. Basic medical training, not enough to be an EMT or medic, but above first aid. We would normally respond to medical calls until the EMTs arrived just to secure the scene. This particular call came out as a 3-year-old girl having a seizure. The location of the call was at a large hotel/resort. I worked at the beach. The closest vehicle access was the front entrance, and I had to go on foot to the actual room. When I pulled up to the front, dispatch upgraded the call and informed the girl had just gone into cardiac arrest. I started running to the room, which was nowhere near the front of the hotel, and after finding it, the family was in complete hysterics. I saw the little girl on the ground in the kitchen, who was still seizing. However, I could see that she was turning blue in the face. The mom grabbed me and started screaming for me to save her daughter. I hadn't performed CPR since the academy. I told the mom and everyone to go out into the hallway and for someone to run to the front to guide the EMTs when they arrived. Suddenly, it was now just me and the girl in the room. The gravity of the situation suddenly hit me. There was no way that EMS would get there in time to help her. I paused for about 10 seconds and just tried to collect myself. Or froze up, I don't know. It's cliche, but those 10 seconds felt like an absolute eternity. Somehow I snapped out of it and began CPR. Amazingly, with the first compression, she suddenly let out a giant cough and started to breathe again. I've been a police officer for 5 years now, responded to countless fatal wrecks, shootings, stabbings, murder scenes, etc. But nothing was as scary as sitting there on the floor next to that girl, knowing that if I didn't do something, she was going to die. My dad told me this story. He said it happened to him his first year as a cop. He was on patrol just like any other day when he got a call from the base. He liked to call it that. He needed to go to where a 911 call was dialed about a mile away. It was a kidnapping. He gets there and pulls up behind a green van sitting in the ditch and approaches it with his gun drawn. He opens the door, and the first thing he sees is a guy in his 40s in a blood-soaked shirt with blood still seeping from his neck. There were multiple stab wounds. He looks to the back of the van where he sees the kid, hands on his face, covered in blood and crying with a Swiss Army knife on the floor. You can imagine what went down. Sure enough, the kid was being hauled away in the van, tied up with a nylon bungee cord, when he remembered that he had his 3-inch blade pocket knife. So he cut himself free and stabbed the kidnapper 9 times in total in the chest and neck while he was driving. After my dad called it in, he stayed with the kid who was still sobbing while repeating, "I killed him. I effing killed him. He was going to take me away and arm me. So I killed him." When I was 11, I moved to a rather large city due to my dad getting transferred at his work. Before that, I lived in a relatively small town, known for its smelly garbage dump. I loved that town with all of my heart, and I still love it even today. But this experience shattered my little kid illusion that it was safe and nothing bad could ever happen to anyone. I lived in a very close-knit neighborhood where all the parents knew each other and all of the kids were friends. At the end of my street has a small, half-built house that became sort of the neighborhood hangout. It had been abandoned during its construction for unknown reasons, and it sat there for nearly 2 years before we all decided that it was the perfect clubhouse. All of the kids would walk home from school together, stop in to tell their parents where they were going, and then head down to the house. One Saturday, I went across the street to my friend's house and asked if she wanted to go to the clubhouse with me. She said she was eating lunch, but she'd meet me there as soon as she was done. I was only 7 at the time, but my parents trusted me enough not to get into any trouble or run off somewhere, so I headed down to the house to wait. I was sitting on the front steps of the house when a white car with very darkly tinted windows pulled up to the curb. To my young mind, it looked exactly like a police car without any lights or indicators on it, so I thought they were undercover. I was 7, cut me some slack. The driver of the car rolled down the passenger window and leaned over the seat, and I could see that he was wearing a police officer's uniform and aviator sunglasses. He waved me over, and not wanting to make the cop angry, I approached the passenger side of the car. "Hey there, you think you could help me with something?" he asked me. He seemed nice enough, so I told him that I'd try. He went on to show me a picture of a little girl that I'd never seen before and asked if I knew her. I shook my head, and he told me that she was missing and that her parents really wanted her back, but he was having trouble finding her. At that point, my friend from earlier, Anna, showed up. The guy asked Anna if she had seen the little girl, but she hadn't either. He then seemed to get really sad and shook his head and said, "I just really wish I could find her. Do you two want to help me look? If you get in my car, we can drive around and see if we can find her." To me, that sounded awesome, and I threw all notions of stranger danger out the window. I'd never been in a police car before, and thought I'd have the time of my life. But Anna seemed to have her head on right, and politely declined. This visibly upset the guy, and he got really angry, telling us that he'd arrest us if we didn't get in his car and help him. Anna and I both started freaking out, and we booked it back to my house when the guy reached into his glove box and pulled out a set of handcuffs. He sped off as soon as we started running. At that point, we were both crying, but we managed to get to my house and tell my mom what happened. She immediately called the police and asked if they had an officer patrolling in our neighborhood, but they didn't. So the real cops showed up to my house and asked me and Anna a ton of questions, and I realized that the scary guy's police uniform was way off. They tried to get a description from us, but he was wearing a hat and sunglasses that blocked most of his face, so it didn't really amount to much. We were, however, able to provide a description of the little girl in the picture. As far as I know, nothing happened with the guy. I've tried searching for any news articles, but I haven't found anything. The description we gave of the little girl didn't match any missing people within a 100-mile radius of our town, so nothing came of that either. After that, none of the kids in my neighborhood were allowed to go to the clubhouse or be outside without at least one adult supervising us. I'm not a cop, but my coworker's father is, and he hit me with this whopper of a story once. For some background reference, I live in Austin, and all of these occurrences were within the Austin Police Department and happened in 1978. An APD officer pulled over a blue Mustang for not having a rear license plate. A man and a woman inside. The officer tries to run the couple through dispatch, but the system is down, so he lets them go with a citation. After letting them go, however, dispatch let him know that the man has an outstanding warrant. The officer pulled the couple back over, and the man, David Lee Powell, knew his arrest was imminent. Crawling into the back seat, he loaded his AK-47 and opened fire as the officer approached. Mortally wounded, the officer called for backup before dying on the side of the road. Officer Villegas, my coworker's father, hears on the radio that an officer is down only 8 blocks away and takes off straight for where he thinks the killer is headed, the highway. Before arriving, however, he finds a blue Mustang in an apartment complex parking lot with its lights off, cruising at a really low speed. He peels into the parking lot, blocking the only exit off, and called for backup. Then a storm of bullets pound his police car, some from Powell's AK-47, some from his lady accomplice's pistol. As they're exchanging fire, Powell hurls a small oval-sized object towards the front of Officer Villegas's police cruiser. To the officer's horror, it was a hand grenade, and he was sure that death was imminent. He explained his last thought being of his wife and kids, and how he is so sad that he wouldn't be able to see them again, and that being the scariest moment in his 38 years on the force. But the grenade didn't go off, and Powell and his lady friend were out of ammo. As backup arrived, Powell took off behind the apartment complex into the woods, whereas the lady accomplice attempted to hide in a ditch. Seeing her in the ditch attempting to reload, Officer Villegas ran up to her and kicked her square in the face, shattering her jaw. Powell was later caught in the woods after a manhunt and received the death penalty for his actions that day. Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them. I also hope that you enjoy the extra rain at the end of this video, and I hope that you get an excellent night's sleep. Good night, everybody.